A wonderful good evening to you all. It's lovely to have you with us. It's a special evening tonight because we don't normally actually interview personalities from the art world, but I think tonight we have a very special guest in Dr. James Hyman, who you will see in front of the. It looks a lovely painting, James, so you'll be able to tell us about it afterwards. James is a very interesting man who I've had the pleasure and privilege of knowing for well over 20 years. Always admired his great taste in his galleries and his art fairs, but never quite been able to afford them. So, but that's a recognition of the quality of the artworks. The This evening is really about understanding what makes an art dealer and an art collector tick. And nobody better to actually discuss that with than James, because in many ways, you've had so many different angles to your career. A scholar, a writer, a critic, an author, a dealer, a gallerist, an advisor, a collector, no doubt a broadcaster too. So tonight it's part of everything, and then most recently a philanthropist, a visionary philanthropist in terms of your creation of a very important institution, the Centre for British Photography. So James, let's start off, if I may, by introducing you to everybody and saying, just tell us a little bit about your background. Are you a Londoner? And where did you school? Where did you go to university, etc.? Can you hear me, James? I can't hear you. You're you're muted, James.
Right, I think it muted me when you started recording because I had
Did I?
to.
I'm very sorry. Did you hear me at least?
Yes, no, I could hear you, so I'll
Okay,
start now.
good.
Thank you for those kind words. I'll give you a bit of background.
Please.
I grew up in North London, in Hampstead Garden suburb. I've moved about 2 roads away from where my mother still lives 60 years later. So she's not moved since she got married. And so I've always been in North London. I went to the local state school, and then I went to UCS in Hampstead. And I then, unusually in those days, became obsessed with art and wanted to either go to art school, or I suppose I was steered towards something more academic, because in those days people thought, well, art school was maybe if you weren't good at other subjects, but you were good at art, that's what you should do, rather than it actually being an exciting career direction. So in a way, I did the next closest thing, which was study history of art. And I did my undergraduate in Manchester and then went to the Courtauld. And at the Courtauld Institute, I did my master's, then I did my doctorate, then I taught there. And by accident, really, I ended up working in a commercial gallery. And that had never been my vision, it had never been my plan. But when I was teaching, one of my second-year undergraduate students came up to me at the end of a tutorial, and he said, I want to start a gallery. This is somebody aged 20. And they're saying, I want to start a gallery. Would you help me to set it up? And I really said, well, that's not what I want to be doing. I like being an art critic, curating, writing as an academic. And he said, well, come and see what we've got. And I said, well, okay. So we went off to Geneva, to the Freeport there, and suddenly I was looking at these incredible paintings by Picasso and Miro and Monet and Matisse. And it was Heli Neymad, who's now well known, but Heli opened a gallery in Cork Street, and I helped him set that up and put on exhibitions of Picasso and Miro and Damien Hirst and some of the YBAs, and we were dealing in Impressionism and modern painting. And in those days, I think today things are more fluid between the different areas of the art market. You have curators at the Tate who then get a job working for an art dealer, or there's more of a flow between criticism and writing an exhibition catalogue. But in those days, it really felt as though I'd burnt my bridges. Even though I had a PhD and I'd been at the Courtauld, I'd turned to the dark side. I'd become an art dealer. And for me, so it was tricky that after a couple of years of working for Heli and for his family, it was very much their family business. And, whether it was my personality or whatever, I really wanted to do my own thing. I'd done my own thing as an academic and as an art critic. And I wanted to be, pursuing my own interests, I suppose. And I couldn't go back to teaching. It was in those days quite hard to, having been in the commercial side, to return to either a museum or to an academic institution. So what I did is set up my own gallery, doing, I suppose, what was closest to my heart, which was the artists that I'd studied when I'd done my doctorate.
Okay.
And that had been, yes, David.
Well, I just want to stop you there because I want to address each part of your interesting career, so that because everybody here is interested in art, yes, but we're interested in from almost really from the consumer point of view in terms of looking at the art and seeing it in galleries. What we don't get the opportunity very often is actually to talk to somebody who's got this range of experience and can share that with us. And I'm sure I speak for everybody that the more we can understand of that background, that would be terrific. Tell us a little bit, if you would, about going back to the Courtauld. I mean, it is the most wonderful and prestigious institution, certainly in this country, and certainly one of the most prestigious in the world. To study there is one thing, but to actually have the opportunity to teach there. So you must have been, without wanting you to be any less modest than you are, but you must have been an exceptional student for them to actually ask you to then continue to teach. I mean, what was the crux of your studies that brought you to teaching and attracted them to invite you to do that?
I think it must be, I'm not an actor. So, I haven't performed on the stage as an actor or a musician or any of these fields. But I do know that as a teacher, if you've got good students and you get feedback, it is incredibly energizing and stimulating and exciting. And I absolutely love teaching. And I still enjoy it, at the Centre for British Photography, which we'll talk about. I spent a year trying to talk to as many groups as I could. And in a way that wasn't directly my job, or maybe not the best use of my time with all the other demands, but I absolutely loved it. And part of that was to try and welcome somebody into what's a big white cube and not have people feel intimidated, and to make them feel that they're a part of things. But partly I just love that exchange and people coming out with ideas, and it's just very, very stimulating. So I love the teaching side. I think why I was teaching there, firstly, my master's had been about art in France, I suppose from about 1900 to 1940 or thereabouts, so covering Cubism and Surrealism. So I was in the modern department. So actually my teaching included Impressionism and Modernism and the modern period. But I think one of the things that was important is back in the day, there wasn't much teaching on anything contemporary or even vaguely contemporary. So in me doing a doctorate on figurative art and its promotion during the Cold War, looking at the period 1945 to 1960, that was about as contemporary as we got. And what was really exciting for me, and maybe contributed something there, is that the artists were accessible. Now, I was looking particularly at what became known as the School of London, and objectively, they were hermits. They weren't accessible. They were very private and obsessed with spending their time in their studio. But I'd been very fortunate that actually when I was still at Manchester as an undergraduate, I'd done my final year dissertation on Leon Kossoff, and I'd got to meet him, and I was very, very close. I probably, until more recent years, he was the artist I was closest to. And I learned an enormous amount from him that was completely different from anything I could learn as an art historian looking at books or visiting museums. And, one of the painters that I was close to described it as the rough and tumble of the studio. But I mean, in the studio, nothing is precious. If Leon or Frank Albach didn't, think a picture worked, it was destroyed. It was as simple as that. And I would occasionally, with Leon, feel this great sense of responsibility because he'd shown me a new painting or a new drawing and asked me what I thought. And on the one hand, I suppose you can say that's very flattering. He was the person, you know, an artist that I really revered, asking what I thought as a 20-something-year-old. But I knew that what I said did matter, that there were very few people he was showing work to, and that if I wasn't careful what I said, that picture might not exist next time, you know, because he was that ruthless, and he'd be asking a small number of people for their thoughts. And it may have just been reinforcing something he felt already. And the very fact that you as an outside person had picked up on that same thing that maybe had been worrying him confirmed that concern. But it really was a different way of looking at pictures. And I'd had a real revelation probably when I was 17 or 18, it might even have been before I went to university. And the father of a friend of mine was a very serious collector. And I went with him, you know, very young, but I went with him to an auction viewing. And first of all, it was exciting to me. I didn't know that there were shops where you could buy pictures. But, you know, I discovered that there was Cork Street, and if you had the money, you could buy a picture. Well, that was a revelation that they weren't all in museums. And then to go to an auction was also a revelation that there was this art market that I knew nothing about. It wasn't part of my background. And I remember him showing me a picture and saying, "What do you think?" And me as a kind of budding art historian is saying, "Well, who's it by?" And he went, "Irrelevant." So I said, "Well, when was it painted?" "Irrelevant." And each question I asked, he would say, "Irrelevant. What do you think of it?" And it was the antithesis of the way I had approached, maybe through book learning or actually reading the labels on captions in a museum, where, you know, you want the information. As an art historian, you want to understand the culture. You want to understand what's innovative or what it's about. And he was saying, "No, that's not important. What's important is, do you feel it in your gut? You know, how does it affect you emotionally? The rest is just words." Well, for me, it's actually both. That's too reductive. For me, the starting point ought to be something visceral, that you've responded to something that has affected you. But to get deeper, I think you do want to know what was the artist trying to do. Where does this, you know, what happened to you know, in my doctorate, I was thinking, what happened to figurative painting after the Second World War? How can you be an artist painting the figure, given what's just happened? You know, how do you reinvent it with a new sensibility that reflects our time, that reflects our inhumanity? You know, idealized, glorified, beautiful figures don't work anymore because we're not these beautiful objects to be put on a pedestal. You know, that we've just created all this horror. And so, you know, looking at Giacometti, looking at Francis Bacon, looking at Kossoff, I was these were the works I really felt. But what's interesting now, you know, we're talking about the mid-80s, and now we're nearly 40 years on. And what's extraordinary is that at that time, you know, the first time I went to see Leon in his home, he said, "Well, why are you interested?" And there was almost a sense that apart from a few people in his circle, there was no outside world that was really interested in what he was up to. So to go and visit, as I did, his studio or Frank Auerbach's studio, you felt like you were a very small, intimate group of basically fanatics because we were so passionate about the work. Or proselytizers. You spend your time telling people how amazing these artists were, often to kind of a blank reaction or no reaction. And so it's actually extraordinary, you know, Frank Auerbach's show at the Courtauld at the moment. I wouldn't have dreamt that that would ever happen when I was there studying work.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I think it's just interesting for our audience to understand that Frank Auerbach, Leon Kossoff, these are great names today, but in the 80s, actually they were not held in such high regard. They were working artists, but not necessarily the top of the tree. So, you know, when you talk about your engagement with them and a small cabal of people who were absolutely passionately engaged with the work, you were in the minority. They weren't in the evening sales in Sotheby's or Christie's.
No, and I think you felt, or I certainly felt at the time that a lot of, not a lot, it was a small group, but it felt somehow outside the mainstream, that there was a sense of emotional engagement and a directness and a rawness. And yes, it was in Bacon as well, and it was celebrated in Bacon. But there was something so visceral in Kossoff in particular, so raw, that it felt kind of un-English. The idea that this is now integrated within a British construction of a British tradition, you wouldn't have believed. You know, these were kind of miserable Jewish artists, you know, and I felt it in a very deep way. But that's because of my background. The idea that this would be shared by people from all backgrounds, I don't think would have crossed my mind in those days. I really felt I was sticking my neck out to support the people that I felt so deeply and was moved so much by their work. So the fact that, you know, Auerbach and others have the status that they now do, I don't think they or we ever felt that that was going to happen in the way it's mainstreamed.
Do you think that either Auerbach or Kossoff or any of these great names of today, 30, 40 years ago, actually desired as a core objective that level of recognition? Or do you think that they were really, as I feel today, that they were painting as much for themselves and expressing what they wanted to do, how they wanted to do it, and really not allowing the outside world to influence them very much?
I think that's true, and I think I probably need to slightly qualify what I just said, because I think in the art world now, it's become much more synonymous with the art market. So there is more of a correlation between, you know, who's at auction, who the sort of commercial art world stars are, and those getting recognition institutionally. You know, that there is more of a symbiosis there. I think the qualification I'd like to make is, you know, Auerbach had a retrospective at the Hayward Gallery. I think it was 1978. But he also in the 80s did represent Britain at the Venice Biennale. Kossoff represented Britain in the 90s in the Venice Biennale. So it's not that they weren't getting prestigious shows or being written about by some of the greatest critics. It's just that it still seemed to be very niche. Yes, they would every now and then there would be a great acclaimed show of Freud or Bacon or Kossoff or Auerbach, but they never seemed very central to what people were looking at or engaging with. They felt like they were pursuing their own course. So to go back to what you said, you know, art in those days was not a possibility for a career. There would never have been an expectation that you would ever earn any money. You know, you might become a teacher and earn money that way, but through your practice, you would never have counted on that as earning you a living. And, you know, if you look at the way that Lucien, Leon, Frank, the way that they have lived their lives, it hasn't changed. You know, the fact that there are more zeros at the end of their prices now doesn't change anything. You know, they were all day in, day out working. That's all that mattered. And I always loved that kind of obsession. And I think that one of the things that drives people is a sense that they can't do something. You know, if something comes to you too easily, you almost don't value it. And I look at, you know, there are the artists who you just think they've got an unbelievable facility and ability. You know, you think of David Hockney, he's just a spectacular draftsperson. His drawing is so apparently effortless. You know, it seems to come so easily. And I'm absolutely in awe of that. But in some ways, it's the opposite of the painters I was drawn to. Well, what I was drawn to was actually the struggle. It's the constant failure. You know, that's what spurs them. And almost with Hockney, it's the opposite, that the reason he's accomplished so many different media, whether it's photography or video or stage design or whatever, is almost because he accomplishes things so easily, he wants the next challenge and the next challenge. And what's so interesting about a Kossoff or Auerbach is it's one challenge. That's a lifetime's project.
Yes.
because it's so difficult what they're trying to do, and because they're permanently dissatisfied. You know, there's the great Merleau-Ponty essay, Cézanne's Doubt, and it's, you know, that was an inspiration for Giacometti, and it's a kind of what stands behind some of these artists. It's the idea that every picture's a failure. That's what keeps you going. Because if you'd got it right, you know, it's the chef d'oeuvre inconnu. If Frenhofer had done the perfect figure right away, there'd be no story.
Yes.
And so this is what excited me, this teetering on the brink, this endless sense that, right, well, we've got to do it, you know, try again, fail better. You know, it's that Beckett thing, isn't it? That you know, you pick yourself up and you have another go, and hopefully the next one will be better.
I must ask you, did you ever have any inclination through your childhood or through university years about actually ever being an artist?
Well, there are two parts to that. I did quite seriously draw, and I think, and I also took etching classes with Mark Balakian, and Mark was the person who did a lot of the etchings for Kossoff, Auerbach, and Freud, and he did a class in Borough, which I used to go to, and so I did try and do my own work. The difficulty you have, I think, as an art historian, is you can know too much. I think that in a way you are more free if you've almost not studied the art of the past.
Mm-hmm.
I just felt everything I did was derivative, you know, and I think in some ways ignorance is, you need the skills. You can't be ignorant of a skill set. But I found it absolutely inhibiting, thinking that whatever I was doing, I could see where it had come from. So I gave that up. But what I had wanted to do also very early on, when I'd considered the art school route, was to be a photographer. And when I was 14, I borrowed my father's camera. He'd been given it, I think when he'd left the job, they'd given him as a present a camera, which he'd never used. And so I put a roll of black and white film in and went out around Warren Street and Tottenham Court Road. And I took photos there. And one of them was of a newspaper salesman in a kiosk outside Warren Street station, little kiosks they used to sit in and sell the paper. And the slogan in those days was, "Everyone needs standards." And you had this very sort of, you know, it was a black and white grainy photo with this great slogan and this old man selling the papers. And I don't know how I found out about it, but each year the GLC, so the precursor to the Greater London Authority, would have a competition, photography competition. And they had one, and I was 14, and I entered it. And in the section I entered, I got first prize. I won it, age 14, with the first roll of film I'd ever taken.
Wow.
And I developed it in the darkroom. So I developed it myself as well. And, you know, it's amazing, you know, aged 14 in 1981, 250 quid. You know, it's an extraordinary.
I was going to say, that's a ton of money.
Yeah, I was in the Jewish Chronicle, but I was in the Evening Standard and being interviewed, and it then was at the Royal Festival Hall, and it toured around. And I was very into the first book.
From Hampstead Garden Suburb.
Yeah, and you know, I think the first book I got on photography was a little pocket book called On Reading, and it was by André Kertész, and it was photographs of people around Paris or New York on balconies or in cafes, and each picture had somebody reading a book. And it was a beautiful one, but it was about, you know, documentary, street photography, and so I would take these sorts of pictures, and you know, I could see they'd come out of Kertész or out of Henri Cartier-Bresson. So again, there's this question of having your eye informed by others. And I do think it's a necessary stage to go through, but I sort of never necessarily got to the other side to have a clear enough vision of my own. But I very seriously wanted to be a photographer. And then when I took a different route, which wasn't art school, but university, I basically, from the age of, let's say, 18 to not quite today, and not quite the age of iPhones, but I just stopped taking photographs. I wasn't taking anything. I wasn't taking parties. I wasn't taking holidays. I did nothing. And I have a huge regret about that now because, for example, I had access to some amazing artist studios. And although they didn't really like being photographed, I did have a relationship with some of these people. And, there might have been opportunities. I mean, it might have been intrusive and it might have been inappropriate, but there might have been opportunities where I could have got out a camera. But I think having been so serious and then not pursued it, I almost didn't want to think about it. Now I take photographs all the time. And, I was very delighted some years ago. I'd been to see Anselm Kiefer in his studio in near Orange in the south of France and took photographs there. And what I hadn't appreciated until some years later, when the Metropolitan Museum got in touch with me, he didn't really allow people to take photographs in those days. So in a book that the Met did, they used my photographs of the studio. So I was very excited that actually there was a use of some of my photographs in that way. But no, I stopped taking photographs. So it's a long answer to your question, but basically I don't draw, paint, or terribly seriously photograph anymore.
So let's just veer back, if I may, to your art dealing. So you worked with Hamed and had obviously, I mean, that must have been an incredible experience on its own. I mean, apart from working with a dynasty family within the art world, but working with really some of the best artworks that was ever available. So and then you decided to go on your own, which was a brave step because I'm assuming that you couldn't possibly afford to have the same level of stock as they had. So it was quite a brave move in every direction. Just tell us a little bit about how that started.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, when I did make that move, I started showing work by some of the painters that I had studied in my doctorate. And it was a mixture of artists who I could get hold of their work, and I loved their work. And very soon I got to represent some artists and estates, and that I hadn't ever counted on, and that was very exciting. But with Helly, we were dealing in blue chip, impressionist, and modern. When I set something up, I left him with no clients and no pictures because there isn't a crossover really between somebody buying a Monet and somebody buying a Kossoff. There wasn't a crossover, so I had to start more or less from scratch. But what I wanted to do is start from an area where I already had a reputation as an art historian or an art critic. So I did show in an early show that we did. It was called From Life, and that included Sickert and Bomberg and Kossoff and Auerbach and Ewan Uglow, and had Tony Bevan was one of the younger people in there. And so, that was true very much to post-war and to figuration, which I'd been so interested in. But what was particularly exciting is that Derek Greaves, who's best known at the time as one of the kitchen sink painters, along with John Bratby and Jack Smith and Edward Middleditch, he lived in Norfolk but had made a visit to London and came to see me and hadn't had a show in London for many years. And, because I already knew him and there was some trust because I'd written about him, I came to represent him. And he became one of our most successful painters. And one of the people that I got closest to, he very sadly died a couple of years ago, but, he was still painting every day until, the end, which was in his mid-90s. So it was an incredible life. And one of the people I was closest to. And he had an incredible gift, not just I think that he's a fantastic underappreciated painter, but somebody with a real gift for friendship, so that he was obviously a lot older than me, but there didn't seem to be any kind of barrier between age or attitude, or we'd have amazing conversations. He was very interested in politics, very interested in the state of the world. So we could talk about Matisse, but we could also talk about, the Gulf War or whatever it was. And I had a lot of love for him. He was an amazing guy. And when it was his funeral a couple of years ago, I gave one of the eulogies. And I think for me, that's very special. But yes, the art world is about commerce because you're all trying to earn a living. But actually, these relationships are very, very special. I had a close relationship with Dennis Creffield, who was one of David Bomberg's students. And towards the end of his life, I went regularly to sit for him. And again, that was a privilege to have that kind of relationship.
But that's something that these are not. There's more than just two artists who you have that bond with. I mean, I remember reading once about Bridget Riley, that you and Bridget Riley would have long conversations. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I'd met her. She came to talk at the Courtauld when I was a student. And I suppose because I was a favourite of my tutor, we went out for lunch afterwards with Bridget.
Who was your tutor at that time?
Well, that was actually Margaret Garlake.
Okay.
And I was very close with Margaret, and we went out for lunch afterwards. And I think Margaret then had to go back to teach. So I just stayed talking with Bridget. And, over the next few years, we became very close. I spent a lot of time with her at the studio, which was her home. We went together to an exhibition that I'd helped curate in Germany and spent time there. And we were very close. And one of my memories of that, the trick that she taught me, which you could probably now find on TikTok or Instagram, it'd probably be easy to find out, but how you revive a rock hard stale baguette. And I remember going round there for dinner, and I would always bring a bottle of red wine, which she would horrify me by basically sticking on a really hot radiator, which she liked to warm it up. And while she did that, she showed me this incredible hard baguette, which she basically ran under the tap, made it soaking wet, and then put it in the oven. And miraculously, you've got a fresh baguette at the end of it. So that was a lasting lesson from visiting Bridget. But I think what was different is it was, again, you have to remember that a lot of these artists weren't always, they were critically successful, but they weren't always in the public eye or commercially successful. And, Bridget went through periods where the work just didn't sell. Mm. And so, even in the 1980s, when I would see her, it didn't feel like crowds of people beating on her door. It was, again, fanatics. But she was incredibly meticulous. There was something about it. You can see it in the paintings, how precise.
Yeah, you can see it in her art.
But I wrote a catalogue essay, and I described the picture as having red, green, and what was it? Red, green, and blue in it. And she was, because it was a catalogue for her, she obviously had to proofread it, and she sort of put a line through the picture is made up of red, blue, and green. And she said, no, it's made up of a red, a blue, and a green. But there isn't just one red, blue, or green. And everything about her work is about the relationship of one colour to the next.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely particular. So it was, I would always learn lessons. I would be absorbing the whole time from talking to these people and seeing how precise.
But But you'd also be giving back. Where I'm trying to come to is that to have a relationship with an artist is quite different in many ways, and yet exactly the same in many ways in terms of having a relationship with your next door neighbor or any friend you like. But you must have brought to that relationship your scholarship and your comprehension of the practice, which would allow them to be neither defensive nor aggressive, but be relaxed and therefore very open about it, which is quite distinctive.
I think it was a slightly paradoxical that these were people that whose work I revered, but I've always probably been too opinionated, is a negative way of putting it, but I would never, if I felt something, I would say it. I wasn't very good at self-censorship. And so if they asked me my opinion on a picture, I would give them my opinion. And so they knew it was done out of respect, because that's why I was there. But I didn't hold back. And, I remember with Bridget talking about a picture, and I was talking about the way I think the pale greens were coming towards me. And on some of these Zig pictures, it's very much to do with forward and back. It's not just relationship one color to another, but actually what is coming towards you, what is receding. And I talked about the way this color was coming forward. And the next day when I spoke to her, she said, you know what, I was up for hours last night trying to work this out, because it's not meant to come forward. And she kind of went back to her color swatches to see what she was doing, whether she'd got it right.
Right.
And I mean, so that's a very particular one about the eye, because it's perceptual abstraction. It is about, for her, these are never pure abstractions. It's about light through branches in a tree. It's about an experience of looking at, light falling patterns. It's visual, it's perceptual.
Yes.
It's not hard edge and it's not cold. But I mean, one of the trickiest things, I had talked about the difference between her paintings on paper, her gouache work, and the paintings. Now, the acrylics, the big paintings, she's, since the 60s, she's been very radical. She's had assistants. So she will do the work on paper, often when she's on holiday in the south of France. And then her assistants can, realize it as a big canvas. And I put that one of the things that animated the works is that it's not clinical. These are not sharp lines. She's not using tape like some artists might to get an absolute edge, a sharp line. That there can be a waviness, which I thought was important when you look close, because it's an assertion of the hand, that these are handmade objects. And again, cross out, cross out, cross out. She said, no, they're straight. So, because they weren't meant to carry traces of the hand, because all that mattered was the overall effect and the optics and the relationships. It wasn't about that at all. It might be that her hand had shaken slightly,
Yeah.
but that wasn't a way of making the lines tremble.
It wasn't
a way of animating them. So, it was very interesting having these exchanges. Just like I said with Leon, he'd ask, well, which of these is better? And he'd say, well, don't you think that one is better? And I'd say, well, no, actually, I prefer this one. But I wasn't afraid to do that, despite, and I suppose what's, I didn't really think about it at the time because I was in a relationship with these people, but it's incredibly flattering. I was a 20-something-year-old student, and the people you revere are asking you, what do you think? And it feeling like it mattered, that it wasn't just a platitude, was extraordinary.
And it did matter. Wasn't a platitude. I mean, they wouldn't have asked you if they didn't want to hear it. So.
No, their absolute priority was doing their work. So they were very grudging of their time. Rightly, because what was more important than being in the studio for them? So I always felt very privileged when I would be talking to these people. Or with Frank at one point, we corresponded, and he's an incredible letter writer. I always felt incredibly grateful. But as an art historian, you are doing something different. So when I did my doctorate, and that was published as The Battle for Realism, I was very pleased that that was published by Yale University Press. It was a piece of history. I was writing as an art historian, not as a spokesperson, not as an amanuensis. I was trying to be objective about the people I loved. And I remember writing to them, I think it was quoting Barnett Newman, about art history. And Barnett Newman wrote, ornithology is not for the birds. And I felt art history is about culture. It's about about visual history, visual culture, but it's not necessarily for the artist to read, almost, because it's saying this is why we think this work is significant, that may go against what they think is significant or what they think the work is about. They're trying to express themselves. And you're saying, well, actually, this had a particular resonance after the Second World War. Well, Frank is not trying to reflect his feelings of loss because he came over here as a child without his parents. He's not trying to convey, he's not providing a commentary on what happened in the war. But the context in which his work was exhibited and written about was nevertheless shaped by those circumstances of the mid-century. And so writing as an art historian is completely different from, what it's like struggling to get it to work plastically in the studio. And so it's almost like at that point, the artist and I were on a different wavelength, because I'm speaking at that point to other art historians, thinking about why is this work important culturally.
But isn't it quite a unique phenomenon that because you've stood in almost each part of the journey. You practiced a little bit as an artist, you studied it to become an art historian, you've criticized, you've authored, you've dealt with, but you've also then looked again back as not as a dealer but as an art historian. So you've got all these different stop-off points in the journey between production and ending up on either a museum wall or somebody's wall. And you've been in each stage of it, which gives you quite a unique perspective, I would have thought.
Yeah, you're wearing different hats. I think that most recently it's been as an art dealer, but also as a collector, and now as somebody who set up a charity. But I think what unites all of them is hopefully I convey my enthusiasm, my obsession, my sincerity, my belief. I wouldn't have, at the point that I was showing figurative art, British figurative art, there would have been easier areas of the market to have worked in. Now, when I'm supporting photography in Britain through our collecting, but also through the charity, that's not something you do if your agenda is to make money. Because, what I'm saying is that photographers in this country are not receiving the support that they should have, whether that's institutionally, critically, in terms of a collector base. Photography isn't supported in the way that it is in America or Germany or France or Italy or multiple other countries. We somehow have this blank, and we can integrate studio ceramics into a narrative of British art. We can, there are all sorts of other media that seem to now become part of a story. There's still this resistance to photography, which I don't understand. So, I think whether I'm trying to sell a picture in whatever medium, or stage an exhibition, or write about it, I'm conveying my belief. I mean, people can decide they don't care what I think about any subject, and that's absolutely fine. But all I can say is I hope people see my sincerity. This is what I'm passionate about, or I could have pursued multiple other areas. I could be spending my life selling Picasso prints, which are some of the greatest prints ever made. But it's not something that I would be excited by or feel in a way that I'm contributing, because there are plenty of other people doing that. Whereas at the point I was looking at School of London, I kind of felt there weren't a lot of voices. So maybe it would matter a bit. Or when I started showing Derek Greaves and Edward Middleditch, I thought, well, the kitchen sink painters aren't well enough known. I believe in them. I want people to see. And now with photography, I think, well, when a museum has a show of photography, the audience figures go through the roof. They are the most popular. And internationally, if we step back from being British or being Europeans or being in the Western world, oil on canvas is bizarre. It is a weird medium. What is more universal than photography? So when I look at the audiences that we have at the centre, or for photography shows that I've worked on, they tend to be very big, very young, very diverse, international. It's an incredibly accessible medium, and yet British museums still seem to have a blank against it, and collectors in this country seem to still have a problem with photography. Now, they'll ask, for example, well, how do we know how many were made? Well, people seem to have understood the issue when it comes to printmaking or to sculpture. You know, that there's an edition. If you abuse that, the market collapses. So for self-interest as much as ethics, the artist, the dealer, has to stick to editions. Well, photographs can also be editioned. And why should that be any less valid or credible than these other media that are? But somehow we have a hurdle about that. Or, as I say, people love exhibitions, but it doesn't always translate into collecting. And, you know, when it comes to museums, it's also to do with whether they have the curatorial expertise. Because photography is one of the best value areas of the entire art market. You know, you could build a great photography collection for, you know, the price of a third or fourth tier Renoir. You know, I mean, it's as simple as that, because, you know, the average price of British photographs is a couple of £1,000. Well, that's a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money in the art world, which is crazy in terms of pricing, has no relationship to almost any other area of life. You know, the prices are just absurd. But the photography is still at the lower end of that. And it would be, you know, I was saying earlier that painters in the past couldn't ever assume that they could earn a living through their practice, so they might have to teach. That's very much where we are with photography. There are very few photographers in this country who could survive through their art alone, you know, which is why they'll do commercial work, whether it's advertising or editorial. It's why they'll do teaching. It's not to say they don't love doing that work as well, but there is a necessity behind that. So, you know, we've tried to do what we can as collectors, and there's a website, hymancollection.org, which has a lot of our British photography collection. And as having set up a charity, and that's britishphotography.org, we're doing what we can both as collectors and as founders of a charity to support photography in this country. So part of that is stepping in where perhaps museums haven't. So we will collect young artists when we feel it really matters, or even commission them. We will give shows to very young artists who probably institutions wouldn't at that stage in their career. Again, thinking about what matters. And that's a thread that, you know, as I say, it felt when I was looking at the School of London early on, or the kitchen sink painters, it mattered that maybe I could help give more attention to the people I believed in. And I feel the same about photography. These are people that I'm passionate about, who I don't think have received their dues institutionally, or necessarily critically. And so, you know, that to me is what's so exciting. And that to me is why it's about a life, not just a livelihood. That is why I'm so passionate about it, because in whatever small way, I like being in an area where I feel I can make a difference. It's why some of the painters that we showed, somebody like Robert Medley, you know, it would either be somebody quite late in their career or somebody who had died, and we were then handling their estate. And I felt these people had been neglected. They might have been neglected because fashion had changed. They might have been neglected because there's a cult of youth. But to, you know, rediscover and represent an older generation figure, or in photography to be passionate about a medium that I felt was neglected, it's trying to create something that not just is for me an obsession and a life, but a feeling of potentially making a difference. And I don't turn my nose up about people who are in the art world to make money, because we all need to make money. And, the fact that I'm doing some of the things I'm doing is because I have been relatively successful as an art dealer. That's the foundation for it. But for me, it's never just been about that. It's really been about a passion and about trying to make a difference, if I can, in the field in which I'm working.
Tell us more, if you would, about this remarkable institution that you founded and its importance and your vision for it, because it is very much your, and I should add, and I'm sure you'd want to equally give recognition to Claire, your wife, because it's my understanding is it's very much a partnership. The passion is shared. Tell us more about the Centre for British Photography.
But if I take a step back, because it comes out of our collecting of British photography.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to, we were excited by what was happening in this country. As I say, we felt that artists were being underappreciated and we were getting very excited. So part of that support was obviously collecting the work and feeling that the institutions weren't really collecting in the way that they might. We collected in a bigger way than is normal. We weren't just collecting so that we could hang it. And that's obviously the sign of an obsessive collector, is that you're buying more than you can actually exhibit or hang. And so our collection was growing and growing. And the big decision we made, I don't remember the exact date, but maybe it's a decade ago now, was to put our collection of British photographs online. And it's very unusual for a private collector to do that, in part because I think a lot of collectors today are also investors or speculators, that there is that blurring now. And I'm not making a judgment about it, I'm just observing that people are buying for investment. And you're not going to want to play your cards, you're not going to want to show what you've got, because your your plan may be to put it into auction. So you don't actually want people to know quite what you've got, you just want it anonymously at auction to make your money. So we were very unusual in putting our collection online, but also unusual in it being almost institutional in doing so, that we wanted it to be an educational resource. And part of that came out of the conversations I'd had with American curators. And they would say, well, we know Bill Brandt's work, we know Martin Parr's work or Chris Killip's work, but who else should we be looking at? And although it's a private collection and there are gaps, obviously, by putting it online, it was a way of saying, well, look, here's a link to the photographer's website. Here's an interesting article. Here's something that's happening. Here's an article that we've commissioned, an essay that we've done on individual work. It became a hub, because there was no one place you could go to find out about British photography online. And so we wanted to use the collection in that way. And what we hadn't really thought about, we were kind of naive about it, is once you let institutions know what you've got, they will want to borrow from you. And so we went from occasionally lending something to suddenly lending a lot. And you can see on the hymancollection.org website some of the recent shows that we've lent to. And it's a lot in this country and abroad. And I love that, because I want the work to be seen. And so we very early on decided, for example, that we wouldn't make a charge for any of our loans. Well, a lot of collectors and institutions do make a charge. We didn't want to, because the whole point was to get the work out there. And I think from that sort of public educational side, we then did a couple of big donations of photographs to institutions. So we donated 125 works to the Yale Centre for British Art, and we donated 100 works to the Bodleian Library. And the reason for those institutions, apart from them being prestigious, they're teaching institutions as well. They're not just museums or galleries. And it was very important to us that there was that dimension as well. And also they weren't so enormous in terms of what they were doing with photography that the work would just get buried, that it felt like it could be a catalyst. And it was a way of demonstrating these institutions' engagement with photography, which wasn't something that they were associated with. So again, it felt like this was something that would make a difference, that could be a catalyst for them then getting a curator of photographs, or a way of waving the flag that then other people might donate work. So again, it felt like it might make a difference. I mean, obviously the thing in this country that is a disincentive is, in America, if you give, you can get some advantage in the tax system. There are tax breaks to encourage giving to museums. In this country, we don't have that culture. We don't have the same incentives or history of incentives. So, to make a donation to a museum, is a donation. There isn't necessarily commercially an upside.
It's gross and net.
Yeah. So I mean, you do that, and but we were very, very we were delighted to do that as a way of kind of stimulating engagement. The Yale Centre for British Art, I thought, well, one of the things is that often it takes a claim abroad for something to get validated at home. We're not necessarily good at celebrating what's under our nose. We'd rather bring something in from abroad and say how wonderful than go to Derby or go to Bath or go to Brighton and look at what's going on there. So it felt like it was making a difference. But having had the collection online, which was almost museum-like, and lending more to other institutions, and then giving to institutions. Although when you do things in life, I don't think things are necessarily planned. I'm not strategic in that sense. Looking back on it, sometimes things have an inevitability. And so in early 2020, we decided to set up this foundation to support photography in Britain. And in a way, I can see now that it kind of was the next stage. But it wasn't planned as such. It just sort of, these things happen. Just like I didn't know that having the website would generate lots of loans and raise the profile of the collection that way. So anyway, we set up the charity in 2020. We then had the pandemic. I had some very good advisors. And I think what's good about having advisors is getting different views. There's no point if all you're doing is saying the same thing. So I'd get one person saying, what you have to have is a centre in London. It needs to be prestigious. You're going to do something for British photography. It's really got to make a statement. You need a centre. You need bricks and mortar. It needs to be in London. And you get somebody else who says, you mustn't build a monument. It needs to be grassroots. It can't be all about London. It needs to be local. It needs to be regional. And, I sort of was in a position of kind of agreeing with all the advice. And so how do you square that circle? So the answer was, we wanted to set somewhere up in London, but work very closely with the regions, that either our shows can go to the regions or actually to be a hub for regional shows coming to London, because there are fantastic shows that never get here. And so, we've worked in the last year, we worked with the National Trust. We've done something with Stills Gallery. We've done something with John Hansard. And, it's really important that we're part of, this kind of public offering. And what's also been important, we opened a centre in Jermyn Street. We had 8,000 square feet on 3 floors. We could have 5 exhibitions at one time. And we did so being free of charge. And huge audiences, young, diverse. Our programming reflects that, although it's generational in what we're showing. I think we were very welcoming. But to explain what our intentions were, I had this dream of a centre that would support British photography. But, it's just one person with this eccentric vision. What we wanted to do was to kind of have a proof of concept, to say, look, this is what we could have. This is the audience for it. Look at the press coverage. We had fantastic acclaim for what we were doing. So it's now tangible. Look what we could deliver. So we took on a 2-year lease with a view to using that as a proof of concept, those 2 years, to get the fundraising we need. Because the intention I had was rather like Sue Davis, who was the founder of the Photographers Gallery in the early 70s. And she had worked at the ICA previously, but became very, very obsessed with doing something for photography. And within a couple of years, it was obviously a different world, but within a couple of years, it was funded by the Arts Council. So there was an individual not trying to create a monument himself, but to create a public space. And I want to do the same. This has never been about creating a private museum or it necessarily being about our collection even. So, I think you need a founder, you need somebody with the vision, but ultimately the success of the charity is that one day it's independent of me. I'm not the director, I'm not a trustee. It's independent, it stands on its own feet in terms of its direction, its curatorial program, but also in terms of its funding. So where we're up to now is we had this amazing year of 18 exhibitions in Jermyn Street and tremendous press reviews and lots of visitors, and then slightly had the rug pulled from under us in that we thought we would be there until this time next year, but the landlords are pulling down the entire block. So we had to leave earlier than we'd ever anticipated. So in terms of what we've delivered, I'm absolutely delighted. Surpassed what I thought we would achieve. But in terms of the fundraising for our permanent home, as I say, the intention was 2 years in a temporary home, fundraise, get into a permanent home. We've now got this sort of in-between stage where we're still flat out. We launched a grants program. So last year we did a couple of open calls, one of which got 1,100 applicants, the other many hundreds. We've just launched our grants program and got 574 applicants, and we're about to announce the first lot of our grants. We've done the show, which, with David, and I'm grateful to David for asking us to do that. So we've got this wonderful show of photography at Ben Uri at the moment. So we'll be working with outside organizations. So, being out there, whether it's with outside venues or a couple of festivals we want to work with, and we're about to launch our touring exhibitions program. So there's a lot we're going to be continuing to do, but we're in this in-between stage. It's not a seamless transition from one space to the next. And I love curating, but a lot of my time at the moment is trying to work on the fundraising, because at the moment I'm the main funder, and that's not sustainable long-term, but nor is it desirable, because I don't want this to be about me. I want this to be bigger than me. And, it's not good. We've got 8 trustees, and I'm one of them, but it's not good if it's too dependent on that one person. I want there to be a day where it's independent of me. So I would say to people, if you believe in what I'm doing, you're backing me, but actually the vision is much bigger than me, than our collection. So that's where I am with that. But to go back to the collection, it's been a very exciting thing, because when people know that you're collecting, they mention friends of theirs who are artists. You get a lot of unsolicited emails as well, but it's all about discovery. And I suppose to link this back to the beginning of the conversation, I'm still at heart an art historian. I wear all these hats that David talks about, but at the end of the day, what I love is standing in front of a picture, or sitting in front of a picture, and feeling that there's a relationship there. And so there's a kind of autodidacticism about it that, I love discovering a new artist. Or when I acquire a work, that's when the research begins. And, I love finding obscure magazines on eBay and an article that somebody wrote in 1976 or whatever it is. And so that discovery as an art historian is still one of the things that drives me. I like discovering a young artist, but I also like discovering material from the past, or working with archives. So that's one of the things we also want to be doing, is acquiring archives so that we can safeguard work. Because I think one of the concerns with some of the older photographers, or actually their families when they're no longer around, is what happens to all these boxes of negatives and contact sheets and work prints and framed up works that are filling the garage. And, you hear horrifying stories, not just in photography, but in painting, of things ending up on a skip. Well, there's an enormous responsibility of taking on an archive, because, you've got to have art storage. You don't have the luxury of just having it in a damp attic or shed. You need to catalogue it, digitize it, look after it, try and get it seen, research it. So, it's an enormous commitment in terms of time and money to take on an archive. But it's absolutely essential. And so that's one of the things that we're also developing, is that whether it's through our collection or through the activities of the charity, we are very mindful of how do we safeguard this work, and how can we then encourage scholarship around it. So one of the things that I want to be doing is working with different higher education institutes in terms of sponsored PhDs, so that people can actually engage with this material. So I think, one of the things about the charity is that there are two kinds of outcome. One is we have our own physical space and it's exhibition driven, which is what really excites me, because I love that curatorial process. And there's definitely an audience for it. But the other thing is these outcomes in terms of support, which is either archival projects or grants for realizing bodies of work where they do need some money in order to be completed. So there's a lot of ways we can engage with and without a space, which I'm very excited about. But the direction of travel is very much that I would like to secure a permanent home. And I do think it's needed. I think it needs somebody waving the flag in that way. And there is definitely a void. There is a space for this. You have in the V&A one of the great collections in the world of photography, but it's one small department fighting with all these other departments, and it's a magnificent collection that isn't all online.
Do Tate have you'll forgive me, I don't know the
Hmm.
photography side of life. Do Tate have a big photography collection and
No,
curators?
no, the Tate have historically been very, very poor. So you could get into the Tate as Richard Long, as Gilbert and George. If you were conceptual and that photography was a tool rather than a practice, fine. But until donations like Eric Franks's collection of photographs of London, a documentary collection, and until relatively recently when they had a photography curator, it was never something they engaged with. And it's still not really something they understand, despite having had some great photography shows.
Mm.
But it's not institutionalized. It's almost incidental that they have these great shows. And again, as with the V&A, you've got photography competing with other media. And then you've got the photographers gallery that is obviously the most established and best known. And of course it does things that engage with its community in Westminster, and it did a Chris Killip show last year, it's got a Bert Hardy show now. But it's, again, not its agenda. Most of its shows aren't anything to do with Britain. And that's great, because it's good that there's somewhere in London that's bringing Dido Moriyama or whoever from abroad and giving them a space in London. But there's nowhere that is specifically dedicated in the way that we're trying to be to practice in this country.
Well, James, I can only tell you a few little things, if I may. Number one is you're absolutely 100% correct that photography exhibitions are a magnet for young visitors. Number two is that museums do not give photography the same level of, or a proportionate level of attention as they do the traditional artworks, and we are just as guilty. And the exhibition that we're partnering with you and the British and the Centre for British Photography is beating records. I can tell you, it's exceptionally well received. And for anybody who has not yet had the chance to visit, you only have 6 more days. Only 6 more days. This Wednesday to Friday, and the next Wednesday to Friday, and it's a beautiful exhibition, beautifully curated with fantastic photographs. The third thing I would say to you, James, is that I think your concept is proven. I know from my visits to the centre, it was always busy, and you say, you've got the facts and figures. So all power to your elbow. And I think everybody here will share with my view is that I've just found this hour and 10 minutes, which is supposed to be 50 minutes, has shot by. Uh, Really inspirational. I mean, fascinating, but inspirational. So if I had a hat, I would take it off to you. I wish you and Claire every success, as I'm sure we all do. And we look forward to hearing more and more from the Centre for British Photography. And just wish you every success. And thank you so much indeed for sharing your time and your life experiences with us. Really, really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for inviting me. And
Thank
thank
you.
you for the opportunity to put on the exhibition.
Well, it's our privilege. Thank you so much. Ladies and
Thank you.
gentlemen, 6 more days. That's all you have to see this exhibition. Then we have an unusual thing for Benuri. It's instead of asking for people to donate money, we're asking people to donate some artworks and anything else to sell so that the money can go to the life and death causes that are all around us. And then an exhibition called Us, From There to Here, which is about immigrant artists from all over the world that have made their careers and enriched our British visual culture. I wish you all a very good evening, and thank you so much indeed for joining us. And again, James, thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody.